The Scandinavian winter descends like a heavy shroud, transforming the landscape into a realm where boundaries dissolve. In these lands of endless twilight and frozen earth, where the sun abandons the sky for months and darkness claims dominion over the living world, the line separating life from death becomes as fragile as morning frost on glass. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Norwegian village as the last light of autumn fades into the oppressive darkness of winter. The wind carries whispers through bare birch trees, and the ground beneath your feet has grown too hard for proper burial. This is the season when the veil grows thin, when the dead who should rest peacefully in their graves sometimes choose to walk again. But these are not the monstrous Draugr of saga and legend, those bloated corpses of Vikings who guard their treasures with supernatural fury and crush the life from intruders with inhuman strength. No, what walks these winter roads is something far more tragic, far more human, and perhaps for that reason, far more terrifying. These are the Gjenganger, literally translated as those who walk again, the restless dead bound to our world not by greed or malice, but by the unbearable weight of unfinished business. The Gjenganger exists in the space between monster and ghost, between the living and the truly dead. They are corporeal beings, their bodies reanimated but not transformed, preserved by the frozen earth and driven by a singular obsession that will not release them. Unlike the Draugr, who swell to monstrous proportions and develop supernatural powers to terrorize the living, the Gjenganger remains recognizable, almost pitifully human in appearance, despite the pallor of death and the stiffness of rigor mortis that never quite fades. In the old farmsteads scattered across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, families learned to fear the sound of footsteps on frozen ground long after the household had gone to bed. They dreaded the sight of a familiar silhouette standing motionless outside the window, wearing the same clothes they were buried in, their face pale as snow but unmistakably recognizable as someone who should be resting 6 feet beneath the churchyard soil. This was not a demon or a supernatural entity from another realm, but someone they had known, someone they had loved, someone they had failed. Before we journey deeper into these walking dead, understand that what you are about to discover is not merely folklore designed to frighten children or entertain around winter fires. The Gjenganger represents something fundamental about Scandinavian culture, about the sacred weight of obligation, the terror of dying with debts unpaid and promises unbroken. If this exploration into the walking corpses of the North intrigues you, if you want to understand how the fear of becoming Gjenganger shaped entire communities and their moral codes, then stay with us through this journey into the frozen darkness. Subscribe now, because the stories that follow will take you deeper into the mechanics of death and obligation than you have ever ventured before. The Gjenganger emerges from a specific kind of death, a death that leaves something essential incomplete in the world of the living. Perhaps a debt remained unpaid at the moment the heart stopped beating, and the creditor still waits for justice. Perhaps a promise was made on a deathbed and broken by those who survived, leaving the deceased unable to rest, knowing their final wish went unfulfilled. Perhaps a terrible secret died with them, buried in their throat but demanding to be spoken, clawing its way back up from the grave through sheer force of necessity. Or perhaps the death itself was wrong, a murder unavenged, a violent end that demands retribution before the soul can move on to whatever waits beyond this mortal realm. In each case, the Gjenganger is not a monster choosing to terrorize the living, but a prisoner, shackled to existence by chains forged from unfulfilled obligation and unresolved earthly matters. They are tragic figures, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The distinction between Gjenganger and Draugr is crucial to understanding both entities. The Draugr is a creature of power and malevolence, often a Viking warrior or chieftain who returns from death with increased strength, the ability to change size at will, and a vicious temperament that delights in destroying those who dare disturb their burial mounds. They guard treasures, they crush bones, they bring plague and madness to entire communities. The Draugr is supernatural, enhanced by death into something more than human. The Gjenganger, by contrast, is diminished. It is less than it was in life. Reduced to a single function, its personality and individuality stripped away until only the driving obsession remains. Where the Draugr might display cunning and rage and a kind of twisted intelligence, the Gjenganger shows only monotonous dedication to its task. It does not grow in size or strength, but maintains the approximate physical capabilities it had at death, perhaps somewhat less due to the stiffness and decay. These were not abstract monsters from distant mythology, but warnings embedded in the social fabric. Reminders that obligations extended beyond death, that the community's moral structure was enforced not just by law and custom, but by the terrifying possibility that those who died with grievances might not stay dead. The Gjenganger served as a supernatural enforcement mechanism for social contracts, ensuring that debts were paid, promises were kept, and justice was maintained even when human authorities failed. The appearance of a Gjenganger typically follows a pattern as rigid as their walking gait. They emerge after sunset, their movements stiff and mechanical, as if their joints had rusted in the grave. Their skin holds the pallor of death, a grayish white that no living person could achieve. But their features remain recognizable enough to identify who they were in life. Their eyes, when they can be seen in the darkness, are often described as empty or fixed, staring ahead with single-minded purpose rather than seeing the world around them. They wear their burial clothes, whatever garments the community dressed them in for their final rest. And these clothes never decay or change, despite the repeated walks through rain and snow. Some accounts describe the Gjenganger trailing the scent of the grave, that particular mixture of earth and decay that clings to them like a second skin. Others report an unnatural cold radiating from their presence, a chill that has nothing to do with winter weather and everything to do with the proximity of death itself. What makes encountering a Gjenganger particularly disturbing is the absence of overt aggression. They do not typically attack the living, do not reach out with dead hands to throttle or strike. Instead, they simply are, existing in a space where they should not be, performing actions they should no longer be capable of performing. Their presence alone is enough to sicken those who see them, to bring fevers and wasting illnesses, as if the body recognizes on some primal level that it is in the presence of something fundamentally wrong and responds with the only defense it has: rejection and illness. Yet despite their tragic and their general lack of violence, the Gjenganger were feared with an intensity that shaped burial practices and social behavior throughout Scandinavia for centuries. Because everyone understood the terrible truth at the heart of the legend. Any of us could become one. Any unfulfilled promise, any unpaid debt, any secret taken to the grave, any injustice left unresolved at the moment of death could be enough to trap the soul in that gray space between life and true death. The Gjenganger was not a monster from outside the community, but the community's own dead, transformed by the weight of what they left undone. As winter darkness settles over the Scandinavian landscape and the frozen ground makes burial a battle against Earth itself, understand that you are entering a realm where death is not always final, where the dead might walk again, not to harm, but to complete, to finish, to resolve what their living selves could not. The Gjenganger waits in that space, neither alive nor properly dead, and their story is just beginning to unfold. Death, in the Scandinavian understanding, was not merely the cessation of breath and heartbeat, but a transition that required completion, a journey that demanded all earthly accounts be settled before the soul could move forward. The Gjenganger exists precisely because this transition was interrupted, because something crucial remained tethered to the world of the living, pulling the deceased back from whatever realm awaited them beyond the veil. Consider the fundamental of debt in pre-modern Scandinavian society, where communities were small and interdependent, where survival through harsh winters required cooperation and trust. When a man borrowed grain to feed his family through winter, that debt was not merely a financial transaction, but a sacred obligation, a bond that tied him to his creditor in a relationship that transcended simple commerce. If he died before repaying what he owed, that unpaid debt became a chain binding his spirit to the earth, preventing his passage to the afterlife. The terror of the unpaid debt was not abstract philosophy, but practical reality embedded in countless documented cases. Villages throughout Norway and Denmark recorded instances of the recently deceased appearing night after night at the doors of those they owed, their presence growing more insistent with each passing evening. The dead man would stand outside the creditor's window, his burial clothes illuminated by moonlight, his face frozen in an expression of desperate need. He could not rest, could not move forward, until the debt was acknowledged and resolved. In the fishing villages along the Norwegian coast, stories circulated of a fisherman who died suddenly at sea, his boat found drifting empty 3 days after a storm. He had borrowed money from a merchant to repair his nets, a sum he planned to repay after the next good catch. But the sea claimed him before he could fulfill his obligation, and within a week, the merchant reported seeing the drowned man standing at the dock each night at the same hour, water streaming from his clothes, his eyes fixed on the merchant's warehouse where the account books were kept. The haunting ceased only when the merchant publicly forgave the debt and marked the ledger as settled, releasing the fisherman's spirit from its obligation. But debts of silver and grain were not the only chains that could bind the dead to walking. Promises carried equal weight, perhaps even greater weight, because they represented bonds of trust and love that went deeper than commerce. When a dying mother extracted a promise from her children to care for their younger siblings, or when a father made his son swear to maintain the family farm, these deathbed oaths became sacred contracts that extended beyond the grave. Breaking such a promise was not merely disappointing the deceased, but potentially condemning them to exist as Gjenganger, trapped between worlds by the unfulfilled vow. The elderly woman who made her daughter promise to light a candle for her every Sunday and pray for her soul, only to have the daughter neglect this duty out of grief or forgetfulness, might find herself compelled to walk again. She would appear in the daughter's home, standing beside the unlit candle, her presence a silent reproach that would continue until the promise was finally honored. One particularly haunting account from a Danish village in the 18th century tells of twin brothers who promised their dying father they would never divide the family land, that they would farm it together and pass it intact to the next generation. When one brother grew greedy and sought to claim more than his share, eventually forcing a division of the property, their father was seen walking the boundary line night after night. His figure moved slowly along the old stone walls that had been violated by the new division, his hands reaching out as if trying to push the stones back together, his mouth moving in silent words that no one dared approach close enough to hear. The haunting persisted for 3 years until the brothers reconciled and reunited the farm, honoring the promise they had broken. Secrets buried with the dead represented another powerful anchor to the living world. Information that died unspoken, truths that were meant to be revealed but were silenced by death's premature arrival, could trap the deceased in the gray realm of the Gjenganger. Perhaps a murdered man knew the identity of his killer, but died before he could speak the name. Or perhaps a woman discovered evidence of betrayal or hidden treasure, but passed away before revealing what she had learned. These secrets gnawed at the dead like physical wounds, creating an unbearable pressure that forced them to walk again, to attempt communication through their limited means. The Gjenganger, with unspoken secrets, might appear repeatedly to specific family members, trying desperately to convey information through gestures or by leading the living to particular locations. They might return to the scene of their discovery, standing in the exact spot where they learned the truth they could not share, hoping that their presence alone would communicate what their dead lips could not speak. In rural Sweden, parish records mention a case where an elderly man was found dead in his barn, under circumstances that suggested he had been about to reveal something important before his heart failed. His granddaughter reported seeing him night after night, standing beside a particular loose floorboard, his finger pointing downward with desperate insistence. When the family finally pried up the board, they discovered documents proving that the farm actually belonged to the man's illegitimate daughter from decades past, a secret he had carried for 50 years and died trying to reveal. Once the documents were found and the rightful inheritance acknowledged, the old man's apparition ceased its nightly visits. But of all the unfinished business that could create a Gjenganger, perhaps none was more powerful than violent death unavenged. In a society where honor and justice were paramount, where the law was often distant or ineffective, and communities were expected to maintain their own order, dying at another's hand without vengeance being sought was considered a terrible fate. The murdered man or woman became trapped not just by their own need for justice, but by the social obligation that their death should not go unanswered. These Gjenganger were often the most persistent and the most disturbing, because their unfinished business required action from the living that might be difficult or dangerous to accomplish. The spirit of a murdered farmer might appear to his family night after night, his burial clothes stained with blood that never dried, his wounds visible and terrible, demanding through his presence that his killer be identified and brought to justice. He could not rest until blood answered for blood, until the scales were balanced and his death was properly avenged. Historical records from Norway include cases where communities, confronted with an insistent Gjenganger, conducted their own investigations to identify murderers that the official authorities had failed to catch. The walking dead served as a kind of supernatural witness. Their repeated appearances at specific locations or near specific individuals providing clues that eventually led to confessions and retribution. In some instances, the guilty party would eventually break under the psychological pressure of being haunted by their victim, confessing to crimes they thought safely hidden. What united all these forms of unfinished business, whether debt or promise or secret or murder, was the fundamental understanding that death was not an escape from obligation. The Scandinavian worldview held that our actions in life created bonds and responsibilities that could not simply be severed by the stopping of a heart. These obligations had weight, they had power, and they could literally hold a soul to the earth if they remained unfulfilled at the moment of death. The Gjenganger was not punishment from the gods or the result of evil behavior, but rather the natural consequence of dying with accounts unsettled. Anyone could become one, from the most honorable farmer to the most respected matriarch. If circumstances conspired to leave something critically unfinished at the moment of their passing. This universality made the Gjenganger particularly terrifying because it meant that death required preparation not just of the spirit, but of all earthly affairs. Families learned to watch the dying carefully, to ask if there were debts unpaid or promises they needed to make on the dying person's behalf, to listen for secrets that needed to be shared before the final breath. The deathbed became a place of accounting, where the dying were encouraged to speak of anything weighing on their conscience, to forgive debts owed to them and seek forgiveness for their own failings. This was not merely good psychology or religious practice, but practical supernatural hygiene, an attempt to ensure that the deceased could move on cleanly without leaving anchors in the world of the living. Yet despite all precautions, sudden death or death that came too quickly could create Gjenganger. The man who collapsed in his field with an aneurysm, the woman who drowned before she could swim to shore, the child who died of fever in the night, all these could potentially rise again if they had carried unfinished business in their hearts when death claimed them. The walking dead were not always created by negligence or evil, but sometimes simply by the cruel timing of mortality. Understand, then, that the weight of unfinished business was not metaphorical in Scandinavian culture, but literal, measurable in the footsteps of the dead who walked again, visible in the pale faces that appeared at windows long after burial. This weight shaped how people lived, how they made promises, how they handled debts and secrets and conflicts. The fear of becoming Gjenganger, or of creating one through broken promises or unpaid debts, served as a powerful force for social cohesion and moral behavior, ensuring that obligations were taken seriously and that death was approached with accounts as settled as human ability could manage. Imagine opening your door on a winter night to find your dead father standing on the threshold, his face pale as the snow beneath his feet, but unmistakably his face, his eyes meeting yours with a terrible familiarity. This is the horror of the Gjenganger, not the grotesque monster of nightmare, but something far worse. The recognizable dead, someone you knew and loved, transformed by death, yet still identifiable, still carrying the features that once brought you comfort, now twisted into a source of existential dread. The appearance of the Gjenganger strikes at something primal in the human psyche, the uncanny valley between the living and the dead, made manifest in corporeal form. Unlike the Draugr, who swells to monstrous proportions, whose body bloats and darkens until it becomes a caricature of humanity, the Gjenganger maintains the approximate shape and features of the person they were in life. Their body does not undergo supernatural transformation, but rather preservation, held in a state between fresh death and true decay by the frozen earth and the obsession that animates them. Their skin takes on a pallor that no living person could achieve, a grayish white that speaks of bloodless veins and stilled circulation. This is not the gentle paleness of someone who has fainted or the sickly yellow of jaundice, but the unmistakable color of death itself, the shade of meat that has been drained and left to cool. Yet beneath this deathly pallor, the features remain intact and recognizable. The nose still the same shape, the jaw still set at the familiar angle, the ears still positioned exactly as they were in life. Witnesses throughout Scandinavian history describe this terrible recognizability with a consistency that speaks to genuine encounters or at least a deeply shared cultural understanding of what the Gjenganger should look like. They reported seeing the exact face they had washed and prepared for burial, the same hands they had folded across the chest in the coffin, but animated now by some force that should not exist. The recognition itself became a weapon of psychological warfare. because seeing your deceased mother or brother or neighbor walking when they should be at rest in the churchyard violated everything the mind understood about the natural order. The clothing of the Gjenganger reinforced this disturbing familiarity while simultaneously marking them as undeniably dead. They wore their burial garments, whatever the family had chosen to dress them in for their final rest. In poorer communities, this might be a simple white shroud tied at the head and feet, the traditional winding sheet that had wrapped countless bodies for their journey into the earth. In wealthier families, it might be the deceased's best clothes, the Sunday outfit they wore to church, now stained with grave dirt and marked by the passage through death. These funeral clothes never changed or decayed, despite the Gjenganger's repeated walks through rain and snow and mud. The white shroud remained white, though perhaps no longer pure, taking on a grayish cast that matched the skin beneath it. The good wool suit stayed intact, its buttons still fastened, its collar still arranged, just as the undertaker had positioned it. This impossible preservation of clothing added another layer of wrongness to the appearance, another detail that signaled this was not a living person, but something that existed outside natural laws. Some accounts describe the burial clothes as damp, perpetually wet, as if the grave's moisture clung to them even above ground. Others reported that the fabric seemed stiff, frozen in place regardless of movement, as if it had become part of the corpse rather than merely covering it. The scent that accompanied these garments varied in description, but consistently involved earth, the deep smell of turned soil and roots, and the underground darkness where bodies were meant to stay. The movement of the Gjenganger distinguished them as clearly as their appearance. Their gait was stiff and mechanical, as if their joints had locked in rigor mortis and never fully released. They walked with a peculiar rigidity, their legs moving in straight lines rather than the natural swing and flex of living locomotion. Their arms hung at their sides or were held across their chests in the position of burial, rarely moving or gesturing, contributing to the overall impression of a body moving against its. This stiffness was not merely supernatural effect, but reflected the practical reality of what they were. Reanimated corpses held together by obsession rather than by life. Their muscles no longer received the constant small adjustments that living bodies make unconsciously to maintain balance and grace. Instead, they moved with the jerky determination of something being puppeted by will alone, their steps falling with unnatural regularity, neither speeding up nor slowing down, regardless of terrain. Witnesses reported that the Gjenganger seemed unaffected by obstacles that would trouble the living. They walked through snow without leaving proper tracks, their feet barely disturbing the surface or leaving prints that seemed too shallow for their apparent weight. They moved through darkness with no hesitation, never stumbling or losing their way, as if the obsession that drove them provided its own form of navigation that required no light or sight. The face of the Gjenganger held perhaps the most disturbing quality of all: the expression, where the living face constantly shifts and changes, reflecting internal thoughts and responding to external stimuli. The face of the Gjenganger remained fixed in a single expression that might best be described as desperate concentration. The eyes, when they could be seen clearly, appeared empty of personality yet full of purpose, staring ahead at their goal with an intensity that excluded all else from their awareness. These eyes did not blink or water or move in their sockets in the way living eyes do. They remained fixed, often described as glassy or reflective, catching moonlight in an unnatural way that made them seem to glow faintly in darkness. Some witnesses reported that the Gjenganger's eyes appeared entirely white, as if the pupils had rolled back or been replaced by the blankness of death. Others saw normal eyes, but noted they never moved to track movement or respond to direct address. The mouth of the Gjenganger similarly remained fixed, often slightly open, as if the jaw had not been properly secured after death or as if the corpse were trying to speak, but lacked the coordination or ability to form words. No breath emerged from this mouth, no fog in the winter air to mark respiration. Yet occasionally, witnesses reported hearing sounds emanating from the Gjenganger. Not words, but moans or sighs, or rattling noises that spoke of air moving through passages that should be still and silent. Compare this appearance to the Draugr, and the differences become stark and significant. The Draugr undergoes transformation, becoming larger than life, its body swelling until it must break through the roof of its burial mound. Its skin turns black or blue-black, taking on a supernatural darkness that marks it as belonging to another realm entirely. Its strength increases to superhuman levels, allowing it to crush bones and lift boulders. The Draugr is enhanced by death, made more than it was in life. The Gjenganger, by contrast, is diminished. It is less than it was in life. Reduced to a single function, its personality and individuality stripped away until only the driving obsession remains. Where the Draugr might display cunning and rage and a kind of twisted intelligence, the Gjenganger shows only monotonous dedication to its task. It does not grow in size or strength, but maintains the approximate physical capabilities it had at death, perhaps somewhat less due to the stiffness and decay. Yet this very ordinariness, this maintenance of recognizable human form, made the Gjenganger more terrifying to encounter for many people. The Draugr was clearly a monster, something that could be fought or feared but ultimately understood as being outside normal experience. The Gjenganger was your neighbor, your family member, your friend, wearing the face you had kissed or shaken hands with, now transformed into something that should not exist. It was personal horror, intimate terror, the violation of specific relationships rather than abstract fear of the supernatural. The preservation of features meant that each encounter with a Gjenganger was unique and specific. This was not a generic ghost or demon, but a particular person, carrying their particular unfinished business, recognizable to those who had known them. A mother would know her son. A wife would recognize her husband. A farmer would identify his former employer. This recognition created a psychological burden that generic monsters could not achieve, because it forced the living to confront not just death in the abstract, but the specific death of someone they had known, someone who should be at rest, but instead walked again. In the darkness of a Scandinavian winter, when a figure appeared at your window or on the path ahead, the moment of recognition was perhaps the worst moment of all. That instant when your mind processed the familiar features, when you understood exactly who you were looking at and simultaneously understood that they were dead and should not be here. That moment contained a special kind of horror. The Gjenganger's power lay not in supernatural abilities or monstrous transformation, but in the terrible simplicity of a familiar face worn by the dead, in the recognizable made unrecognizable by the mere fact of its impossible presence. The Gjenganger does not wander aimlessly through the night like a lost spirit searching for rest. Their movement follows patterns as rigid and unchanging as iron rails, predetermined routes that they traverse with mechanical precision night after night, week after week, potentially for years if their unfinished business remains unresolved. This repetitive behavior defines their existence, transforms them from individuals into living embodiments of a single, unfulfilled purpose. Prisoners locked inside their own obsession with no possibility of deviation or escape. Picture a widow waking night after night to the sound of footsteps on the path outside her cottage. The same measured rhythm, arriving at precisely the same hour. She knows without looking that it is her dead husband, walking the route he took each evening when alive to check on his livestock in the far pasture. But the livestock have been sold. The pasture stands empty, and still he walks, trapped in the pattern of his living habits, unable to comprehend that his earthly duties no longer require completion. His obsession is not with the animals themselves, but with the routine, the unbreakable habit that death could not erase. This is the defining characteristic of the Gjenganger's behavior, the absolute inability to deviate from their purpose or their pattern. Where the Draugr might adapt and scheme and respond to changing circumstances with cunning intelligence, the Gjenganger is locked into a single track, running the same loop endlessly like a mechanism with no off switch. Their intelligence, whatever remains of it after death, narrows to a laser focus on one objective, one action, one unfulfilled need that consumes all other thought and capability. In a farming village in 19th century Norway, records document the case of a man who died owing money to the village blacksmith. Every night for 3 months, villagers reported seeing him walk the exact path from his former home to the blacksmith's forge, arriving at the door, standing motionless for several minutes, then turning and walking back the same way. He never varied his route, never attempted to enter the forge when the door stood open, never acknowledged anyone who spoke to him or stood in his path. He simply walked, stood, and returned over and over, until his widow finally gathered enough money to pay the debt and placed it on the blacksmith's anvil in her dead husband's name. The moment the debt was settled, the nightly walk ceased. The Gjenganger did not gradually fade or slowly depart, but simply stopped appearing, as if a switch had been thrown, the obsession fulfilled and the mechanism finally allowed to power down. This immediate cessation was typical of Gjenganger hauntings, suggesting that their existence was sustained entirely by the unfinished business and nothing else. No lingering personality or desire beyond the single driving need. But not all Gjenganger behavior followed such straightforward patterns. Some appeared before specific family members with desperate regularity, standing at windows or doorways, their presence a silent communication that the living struggled to interpret. A daughter might wake repeatedly to find her dead mother standing at the foot of her bed, the pale figure motionless in the darkness, her empty eyes fixed on her child with an intensity that transcended the grave. What did she want? What message was she trying to convey through her mere presence? These appearances before specific individuals suggested that the Gjenganger retained some capacity to target their haunting, to identify the person who could resolve their unfinished business or who bore some responsibility for their trapped state. The dead mother appearing to her daughter might be reminding her of a broken promise, demanding the fulfillment of a deathbed oath, or trying to reveal a secret that the daughter needed to know. But the Gjenganger's limited intelligence and inability to speak made communication nearly impossible, creating a torturous situation where both the dead and the living suffered from the inability to bridge the gap between them. The repetitive appearances took various forms depending on the unfinished business. A Gjenganger, bound by an unpaid debt, might appear repeatedly at the creditor's door or window, never entering, never speaking, simply manifesting their presence as a reminder of the obligation. A Gjenganger with a secret to reveal might return again and again to the location where the secret was hidden or learned, standing in the exact spot, perhaps gesturing toward a particular object or direction, trying desperately to communicate through the limited vocabulary of position and persistence. One particularly tragic case from Denmark involved a young woman who died in childbirth. her infant surviving only a few days before, also succumbing. The woman's spirit was seen repeatedly in the churchyard, always at the grave where her child had been buried, standing motionless beside the small plot. Her appearances disturbed the parish for weeks, until an elderly woman suggested that perhaps the mother had made a dying request about how the child should be buried, a request that had gone unfulfilled in the chaos and grief following both deaths. Upon investigation, the midwife remembered that the dying mother had begged that a specific locket be buried with the child, a family heirloom that contained her own mother's hair. The locket had been forgotten in the rush to arrange both funerals. Once it was retrieved and properly buried with the infant, the young mother's nightly visits to the grave ceased immediately. What made these repetitive hauntings particularly disturbing was their monotonous consistency. The Gjenganger never displayed emotion or variation in their behavior. They did not grow more aggressive or more desperate as time passed. They did not try new approaches or different methods of communication. They simply repeated the same action, followed the same path, appeared at the same location, with a persistence that suggested infinite patience, or perhaps the complete absence of awareness that time was passing at all. This robotic consistency revealed the truth of what the Gjenganger had become. Not a person anymore, but a function, a purpose given form, stripped of personality and reduced to pure obsessive need. The person they had been in life, with all their complexity and contradictions and multiple desires and fears, had been compressed down to a single point of focus. Everything else that made them human had been discarded or lost, leaving only the obsession to animate the corpse. Yet despite this reduction, despite becoming essentially a mechanism rather than a being, the Gjenganger was not typically violent. Unlike the Draugr who actively attacked intruders and delighted in crushing the life from those who disturbed their rest, the Gjenganger rarely, if ever, physically harmed the living. Their danger lay not in direct assault, but in their presence itself, in the wrongness of their existence and the effect that wrongness had on those who encountered them. Witnesses to Gjenganger activity consistently reported falling ill after encounters, developing fevers, and wasting sicknesses that physicians could not explain or treat effectively. These illnesses were not caused by any active malice from the Gjenganger, but seemed to result simply from exposure to something that violated natural law. The living body recognized on some primal level that it was in the presence of death animated, of something that should not exist, and responded with the only defense it had: rejection and illness. The sickness that followed Gjenganger encounters varied in severity, but followed consistent patterns. Victims reported bone-deep cold that no fire could warm, weakness that made simple tasks exhausting, loss of appetite and inability to sleep peacefully. Some described vivid nightmares of being buried alive or of standing frozen in place, unable to move, while something approached from the darkness. Others developed a wasting condition where they seemed to slowly fade, losing weight and vitality as if something were draining their life force, though the Gjenganger made no active attempt to feed on them. This passive harm, this sickening by mere proximity, reinforced the tragedy at the heart of the Gjenganger legend. They were not monsters choosing to terrorize the living, but victims themselves, trapped in a state between life and death, unable to rest, unable to move forward, condemned to repeat the same actions endlessly in a desperate attempt to complete what they left unfinished. Their presence harmed others not through intention, but through the fundamental wrongness of their existence, making them simultaneously pitiable and terrifying. Families who found themselves haunted by a Gjenganger faced a psychological ordeal that wore down even the strongest spirits. The nightly repetition, the knowledge that the dead walked outside your door or stood at your window, the inability to help or communicate effectively with the trapped spirit, all combined to create an atmosphere of dread and helplessness. You could not fight the Gjenganger, could not drive them away through force or prayer or iron. You could only discover what they needed and attempt to provide it, hoping that you correctly understood their purpose before their presence made you too sick to act. The obsessive behavior of the Gjenganger served as a mirror reflecting the obsessive of the obligations that bound them. Just as they walked the same path endlessly, so too did the unpaid debt or broken promise weigh endlessly on their consciousness, if consciousness was even the right word for what remained. They were trapped in loops of their own making, or perhaps more accurately, trapped in loops created by the circumstances of their death and the unfinished business they left behind. Their repetitive haunting was not a choice, but a condition, a state of being that would continue unchanging until someone from the world of the living finally broke the cycle by resolving what they could not. To understand the Gjenganger fully, you must first understand what they are not. Because in Scandinavian folklore, the distinction between different types of undead is not merely academic, but fundamental to survival and resolution. The Draugr and the Gjenganger both walk after death, both disturb the living, both violate the natural boundary that should separate the world of breath from the world of silence. Yet they are as different from each other as a wolf is from a dog. Related perhaps in distant ancestry, but divergent in the purpose and the danger they represent. The Draugr emerges from the sagas as a creature of power and malevolence, typically a warrior or chieftain of significant strength and will who refuses to accept the limitations of death. These are men who lived by violence and dominance, who amassed wealth through raid and conquest, who commanded respect through fear and capability. When such individuals die, particularly if they are buried with their treasures in isolated mounds, they sometimes return as Draugr, their already formidable abilities enhanced by supernatural transformation into something far more terrible than any living man could hope to match. The physical transformation of the Draugr is dramatic and unmistakable. Their bodies swell to enormous size, growing until they must break through the roof of their burial chamber to accommodate their bulk. Their skin darkens to a deep blue-black color that speaks of otherworldly corruption rather than natural decay. Their strength increases to levels that allow them to crush bones with casual ease, to lift boulders that would require teams of men to move, to tear apart anyone foolish enough to enter their domain. The Draugr becomes more than human, elevated by death into a category of supernatural threat. But the Draugr's power extends beyond mere physical capabilities. They possess cunning intelligence that allows them to set traps, to plan ambushes, to recognize and remember individuals who have wronged them. They can shapeshift, transforming into bulls or seals or other creatures to move through the world undetected, or to approach victims from unexpected angles. Some sagas credit them with the ability to control weather, summoning storms and fog to confuse and endanger travelers. Others describe them spreading disease through their mere presence, bringing plague to entire communities as punishment for disturbances to their rest. The Draugr guards treasure with obsessive ferocity, protecting the gold and weapons and precious objects buried with them, as if these material goods retained value beyond death. They remain aware of their surroundings, reactive to intrusion, actively hunting those who dare approach their burial mounds. When heroes in the sagas confront Draugr, the encounters are epic battles requiring extraordinary courage and strength, often ending with the hero barely surviving after tremendous struggle. The Draugr is a worthy opponent, a monster that tests the limits of mortal capability. Compare this to the Gjenganger, and the differences become immediately apparent and profoundly significant. The Gjenganger does not grow or transform physically beyond the changes natural death brings. Their body maintains the approximate dimensions it held in life, perhaps somewhat shrunken by dehydration and the settling of flesh, but never swelling to monstrous proportions. Their skin pales rather than darkens, taking on the grayish-white of bloodless tissue rather than the supernatural black of the Draugr. They possess no enhanced strength, no ability to crush or lift beyond what they might have managed while alive, and often considerably less due to the stiffness of death. The intelligence of the Gjenganger is perhaps the most striking difference from the Draugr. Where the Draugr retains cunning and awareness and the ability to adapt and plan, the Gjenganger's consciousness, if it can even be called consciousness, narrows to a single sharp point of obsession. They cannot scheme or set traps or recognize individuals beyond their singular purpose. They do not remember slights or plan revenge in the complex way the Draugr might. Instead, they function almost mechanically, driven by one unfulfilled need that consumes all other thought and capability. A Draugr might recognize you as the grandson of the man who disturbed its mound decades ago and target you specifically for vengeance across generations. A Gjenganger would not recognize you at all unless you were directly connected to their specific, unfinished business. They are not aware of the world around them in any meaningful sense, only aware of the single task that keeps them walking, the single objective that prevents their rest. This limitation makes them less dangerous in some ways, but more tragic, because it reveals the degree to which death has stripped away their humanity and personhood. The Gjenganger possesses no treasure to guard and shows no interest in material wealth. Unlike the Draugr, who clings to gold and weapons as if these objects define their worth and identity, the Gjenganger is motivated entirely by intangible obligations. Debts of honor, promises made, secrets untold, justice unserved. You could pile gold at a Gjenganger's feet, and they would walk past it without acknowledgement, their eyes fixed on their obsessive goal, utterly indifferent to riches that mean nothing to their singular purpose. This absence of treasure-guarding behavior reflects a fundamental difference in what creates these two types of undead. The Draugr emerges from a life defined by acquisition and dominance, from a personality strong enough to impose its will even after death. The Gjenganger emerges from incomplete social obligations, from the disruption of bonds and promises that should have been maintained. One is created by excess of self, the other by deficit of resolution. One demands recognition of its power, the other simply needs completion of what was left unfinished. The supernatural powers that make the Draugr so formidable in combat and so dangerous to communities are entirely absent from the Gjenganger. They cannot shapeshift into animal forms or summon storms or spread plague through conscious will. They possess no ability to affect the physical world beyond their own shuffling movement along predetermined paths. The sickness that sometimes follows encounters with Gjenganger is not an active power they wield, but a passive consequence of their unnatural existence. The body's response to proximity with something that violates the boundary between life and death. The only supernatural capability the Gjenganger demonstrates is the simple fact of their continued existence after death, their immunity to true mortality as long as their unfinished business remains unresolved. This is not immortality in the sense of eternal life, but rather an inability to complete the transition to death, a suspension in the gray space between states. They can be damaged, but seem not to notice or care about physical harm. They can be observed, but cannot be truly interacted with in any meaningful way. They exist, but do not live, persist, but do not experience. This fundamental difference creates an equally fundamental difference in how the living must respond to each type of undead. Confronting a Draugr requires physical courage and strength, weapons and strategy, often the assistance of multiple warriors or the intervention of particularly powerful heroes. The solution to a Draugr problem is combat and destruction, wrestling the creature until its head can be cut off and its body burned to ensure it cannot rise again. The approach is violent and direct, matching force with force. The Gjenganger cannot be defeated through combat because they are not truly fighting you. You cannot destroy them through violence because they are already dead. And further damage to their corpse does nothing to address the obsession that animates them. The only solution to a Gjenganger problem is understanding and resolution, discovering what unfinished business binds them and taking action in the world of the living to complete it. This requires investigation and empathy rather than strength, social action rather than individual heroism. Nor is the Gjenganger a demon in the theological sense, despite their disturbing presence and their violation of natural law. They are not servants of evil forces or manifestations of malevolent spiritual entities. They possess no agenda beyond their singular obsession, no desire to corrupt or destroy for its own sake. They are not testing your faith or tempting you towards sin or acting as agents of supernatural evil. They are simply trapped, prisoners of circumstance and incomplete obligation, as much victims as threats. This absence of demonic means that traditional protective measures against evil spirits often prove ineffective against Gjenganger. Holy water and prayers and blessed objects might provide psychological comfort to the living, but do nothing to address the core issue that keeps the dead walking. The Gjenganger is not repelled by sacred symbols because they are not opposing the sacred. They exist in a category outside the normal framework of good and evil, neither blessed nor cursed, but simply unfinished. Understanding these distinctions between Gjenganger and Draugr and demons is not merely an exercise in folklore classification, but essential practical knowledge for anyone who might encounter the walking dead. Approaching a Gjenganger as if it were a Draugr, attempting to fight or destroy it through violence, wastes time and energy while leaving the actual problem unresolved. Treating a Gjenganger as a demon, attempting to exorcise or banish it through religious ritual alone, similarly misses the point of what they are and what they need. The Gjenganger requires neither combat nor exorcism, but completion, the fulfillment of whatever obligation tethers them to the world of the living, and only then can they finally rest. The solution to a Gjenganger haunting lies not in violence or exorcism, but in understanding and action, in discovering what keeps the dead walking and taking concrete steps to resolve it. This is both simpler and more complex than fighting a monster, because it requires investigation, empathy, and often difficult decisions about justice and obligation. But once the unfinished business is truly completed, once the chain binding the spirit to earth is finally broken, the release is immediate and absolute, as if a great weight has been lifted not just from the dead, but from the living world itself. Consider the widow whose husband walks each night to the creditor's door, his pale figure a nightly reminder of unpaid debt. The solution seems straightforward. Pay what is owed. But what if the widow lacks the means? What if the sum is beyond her capacity to gather? In such cases, the community itself might intervene, recognizing that the haunting affects not just the creditor and the widow, but everyone who must witness the walking dead. Neighbors might contribute, the church might offer assistance, or the creditor himself might choose to forgive the debt, releasing both the living and the dead from their mutual torment. The moment the debt is settled, through payment or forgiveness or public acknowledgement that it has been resolved, the Gjenganger simply ceases. They do not fade gradually or depart with ceremony, but stop appearing as immediately as a candle blown out. One night the widow looks out her window and sees her husband's figure on the path. The next night she looks and sees only empty darkness. The chain has broken, the obligation fulfilled, and whatever remained of her husband's consciousness or obsession has finally been allowed to complete its interrupted journey to the afterlife. But not all unfinished business can be resolved so cleanly or quickly. When the Gjenganger's purpose involves revealing a secret, the living must first interpret what the dead are trying to communicate through their limited means. This requires observation and intuition, watching where the Gjenganger appears, what they seem to be focused on, what patterns emerge from their repetitive behavior. Are they always standing near a particular object or location? Do they appear more agitated, if such a word can apply to their mechanical movements, when certain people are present? Do they gesture or position themselves in ways that might indicate direction or emphasis? Families haunted by Gjenganger with secrets to reveal often spent weeks or months trying to decode the message, searching the places where the spirit appeared, questioning their own memories of the deceased's final days, consulting with elders who might have knowledge of family history or local events that could provide context. When the secret was finally discovered, whether documents hidden under floorboards, or confessions wrung from guilty parties, or simple truths about parentage or property that had been deliberately obscured, the relief was profound, and the haunting ended as completely as if it had never been. The most challenging unfinished business involved vengeance for violent death, because resolution required identifying the killer and ensuring justice was served. In communities where official law enforcement was distant or ineffective, where months might pass between a crime and any investigation, the appearance of a murder victim as Gjenganger could provide crucial impetus for the community to take action. The walking dead served as undeniable evidence that justice had not been achieved, that someone had escaped accountability for taking a life, and their presence demanded resolution. Sometimes the Gjenganger's behavior provided clues to the killer's identity. They might appear repeatedly near a specific person or location, their obsessive focus creating a kind of accusatory presence that eventually broke the guilty party's resolve. Historical accounts document cases where murderers confessed after weeks or months of being haunted by their victim. The psychological pressure of seeing the dead walk proving more effective than any interrogation or threat of legal punishment. Once confession was made and appropriate justice administered, whether through official trial or community action, the victim's spirit would finally rest. Yet even with these methods of resolution, the process could take time, and communities learned that prevention was far preferable to cure. The burial practices that developed throughout Scandinavia reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to keep the dead from walking, how to ensure that even those with unfinished business at the moment of death would remain in their graves rather than rising to haunt the living. These practices varied somewhat by region and era, but shared common themes rooted in physical restraint and spiritual protection. The placement of coins on the dead person's eyes served multiple symbolic functions simultaneously. These coins would pay the ferryman for passage to the afterlife, ensuring the deceased had the means to complete their journey and was not left stranded on the threshold between worlds. But the coins also had a more practical purpose. Their weight kept the eyelids closed, preventing the dead from looking out at the world they had left behind. There was deep belief that if the corpse's eyes remained open in the grave, they might continue to see and desire the world above, creating an anchor that could pull them back from their proper rest. Stones, or sometimes iron nails placed in the mouth of the corpse, served a similar restraining function. This practice prevented the dead from speaking, from crying out or attempting to communicate with the living. But it also carried deeper meaning related to consumption and hunger. The fear that the dead might try to eat or drink if their mouths remained free. By blocking the mouth with stone or metal, the living ensured that the deceased could neither speak their grievances nor attempt to sustain their reanimated body through any form of consumption. Physical binding of the corpse represented a more direct approach to prevention. The body might be wrapped tightly in its burial shroud, the fabric tied at head and feet to restrict movement. Some communities went further, binding the ankles and wrists with cord or placing the body in positions that would make walking difficult or impossible if it somehow achieved animation. The knees might be tied to the chest, or the arms bound tightly across the body, or weights placed on the limbs to pin them down. These measures reflected the practical understanding that a body which could not move its legs could not walk, that physical restraint might succeed where spiritual measures alone failed. The location of burial carried its own protective significance. Burying the dead at crossroads, particularly where four roads met, was believed to confuse any spirit that might attempt to rise. If the Gjenganger emerged from such a grave, they would face four potential directions and lack the intelligence to choose among them, their limited consciousness unable to navigate the decision. They would remain at the crossroads, trapped by indecision, rather than successfully walking toward their obsessive goal. Burial in consecrated ground, particularly in church property or land that had been specifically blessed for the purpose, provided spiritual protection that supplemented physical restraints. The holy ground itself was believed to keep the dead peaceful, to smooth their transition to the afterlife and prevent the kind of spiritual disturbance that could lead to walking. Churches often maintained their own graveyards specifically for this reason, creating spaces where the dead would be surrounded by prayer and sacred architecture that reinforced the boundary between worlds. Some particularly troublesome cases or individuals at high risk of becoming Gjenganger received special burial treatment combining multiple preventive measures. The body might be bound, weighted with stones, buried with coins and stones in place, positioned at a crossroads within consecrated ground, and additionally protected with iron objects placed in the coffin. Iron, with its long-standing reputation for disrupting supernatural forces, served as another barrier against animation, its presence supposedly interfering with whatever force might otherwise enable the dead to rise and walk. For those who died with particularly serious unfinished business or under circumstances that suggested high likelihood of becoming Gjenganger, communities sometimes took preemptive action to resolve the issues before burial. Debts might be paid from the deceased's estate before other inheritances were distributed. Promises might be fulfilled by family members acting on the dead person's behalf. Secrets might be shared or confessions heard and recorded. The goal was to eliminate the unfinished business before it could bind the spirit, to ensure that the person went into the ground with all earthly matters as settled as human capability could achieve. These preventive measures reflected a practical, almost engineering approach to the supernatural. The Scandinavian worldview treated the walking dead not as mysterious phenomena beyond human influence, but as problems with identifiable causes and concrete solutions. If the dead walked because of unfinished business, then finishing that business or preventing the walking through physical means became logical responses. The supernatural was real and dangerous, but it operated according to understandable principles that could be learned and applied. Yet despite all precautions, despite the careful attention paid to burial practices and the resolution of earthly affairs, some individuals still became Gjenganger. Sudden death, hidden grievances, secrets too dangerous to reveal in life. All these could create walking dead despite the community's best efforts at prevention. When this happened, when a familiar figure began appearing after sunset, walking the same path night after night, the living had no choice but to engage in the difficult work of discovery and resolution, unraveling what kept the dead from resting and taking whatever action was necessary to finally break the chain and allow the spirit to complete its long-delayed journey beyond the veil. The Gjenganger might seem like pure folklore, stories told to frighten children or explain mysterious phenomena, except for one troubling detail: the physical evidence found in graves throughout Norway and Denmark when circumstances required exhumation. When communities disturbed burial sites for practical reasons, when churches expanded their graveyards or families relocated remains or authorities investigated suspicious deaths, they sometimes discovered bodies positioned in ways that contradicted their original burial arrangements. These discoveries, documented in church records and local archives, provided tangible evidence that something had indeed moved in the darkness beneath the earth. Picture the scene when a rural Norwegian church decided to expand its graveyard in the mid-19th century. Workers tasked with relocating older graves to make room for new burials opened a coffin that had been sealed and buried 6 months earlier. They expected to find the body positioned exactly as the undertaker had arranged it. Laid flat on its back, arms crossed over the chest, head resting on a small pillow, peaceful in death. Instead, they discovered the corpse on its side. One arm extended toward the coffin lid, as if it had been reaching, trying to push through the wood. The burial shroud was torn and twisted around the body. The coins that had been placed on the eyes were missing, found later at the bottom of the coffin, and the careful arrangement of death had been completely disrupted. Such discoveries were not isolated incidents, but occurred with enough frequency across Scandinavia to establish patterns and generate official documentation. Church records from the 17th through 19th centuries contain numerous accounts of exhumations that revealed disturbed bodies, corpses found in positions inconsistent with burial practices. Priests and local authorities recorded these findings with careful detail, noting the specific ways the bodies had moved and the condition of the burial goods and coffins. These were not superstitious peasants seeing ghosts and shadows, but educated officials documenting observable physical evidence that contradicted expected decay patterns. In a Danish village in 1742, authorities exhumed a woman who had died under suspicious circumstances. Her death attributed to sudden illness, but whispered about as possible murder. The original burial had positioned her in the traditional manner, flat on her back with her hands folded peacefully. When the coffin was opened for investigation, the body was found face down, the hands pressed against the coffin lid with enough force that the wood showed marks of pressure. Her burial dress was bunched and twisted, suggesting violent movement, and her jaw hung open despite having been tied shut with cloth during the original burial preparations. The cloth that had secured her jaw was found torn and discarded in the corner of the coffin. The official explanation for such findings often invoked natural processes. Gases building up in the decomposing body causing movement, the settling of flesh and bone creating the illusion of repositioning, animals or water infiltration disturbing the grave. But these explanations struggled to account for the specific patterns observed, particularly cases where the body had clearly turned completely over or moved to positions that would require coordinated muscular action rather than random settling. How does a corpse turn from back to stomach through mere gas pressure? How do hands that were carefully positioned on the chest end up pressed against the coffin lid without the intervention of some animating force? One of the most extensively documented cases comes from a Norwegian coastal village, where a fisherman was buried after drowning at sea. His body was recovered and prepared according to tradition, bound in his burial shroud with particular care, given that drowning victims were considered at high risk of becoming restless dead. Coins were placed on his eyes, stones in his mouth, and his ankles were tied together to prevent walking. Yet when the grave was opened a year later to enter his widow beside him, witnesses found the body positioned vertically in the coffin, as if it had been trying to stand. The bindings on the ankles had been torn, the stones were scattered, and the burial shroud hung loose around the shoulders like a discarded garment. The community response to this discovery was immediate and specific. They recognized the signs of attempted Gjenganger activity, the evidence that the fisherman's spirit had been trying to walk despite the preventive measures taken. An investigation revealed that the fisherman had died owing significant money to a merchant, a debt his widow had been unable to pay due to their poverty. The merchant, confronted with the evidence from the grave and the clear implication that the dead man would not rest until the debt was resolved, chose to forgive the obligation publicly. The fisherman was reburied with fresh bindings and additional preventive measures, and subsequent checks of the grave showed no further disturbance. The findings also validated and reinforced burial practices, demonstrating which preventive measures were most effective. Graves where multiple restraints had been employed showed less disturbance than those with minimal preparation. Bodies buried at crossroads or in consecrated ground seemed less likely to achieve the coordinated movement necessary to fully reposition themselves. These observations allowed communities to refine their practices, to develop more effective protocols for ensuring the dead remained properly dead, even when they died with unfinished business weighing on their souls. Particularly disturbing were cases where the body had clearly made progress toward escape. Coffin lids showed scratch marks from the inside, wood splintered where fingers or fists had repeatedly struck the same spot. In a few extreme cases, the coffin had actually been breached, the lid broken through though the body remained trapped by the weight of earth above. These discoveries suggested that some Gjenganger possessed more animation and determination than others, that the strength of the unfinished business might correlate with the intensity of their attempts to rise and walk. The condition of burial goods provided additional evidence of supernatural activity. Coins placed on eyes were found scattered throughout the coffin or pressed into corners as if violently displaced. Stones meant to weight the mouth were discovered crushed or pushed aside. Iron objects included for protection showed signs of corrosion far beyond what the burial environment should have produced, as if their protective properties had been actively engaged against supernatural forces. Clothing and shrouds showed wear patterns inconsistent with natural decay, torn in specific ways that suggested grasping hands or violent struggling. In some documented cases, the disturbed grave contained more than just a repositioned body. Soil inside the coffin showed evidence of having been displaced and redistributed, suggesting the body had moved repeatedly over time rather than in a single violent event. Wooden coffin interiors bore marks that matched the deceased's fingernails or teeth, evidence of sustained attempts to break free. Most disturbing were cases where the body's position suggested it had been attempting specific actions, reaching toward a particular direction as if trying to point, mouth open as if trying to speak, hands positioned as if attempting to push or pull something. Authorities and church officials who documented these findings often struggled with how to interpret and record them. Official documents typically used careful, neutral language that described observations without drawing explicit, supernatural conclusions. A body might be noted as found in an unusual position or showing unexpected displacement. But the record would stop short of declaring this evidence of walking dead. This careful phrasing allowed the documentation to serve both practical and theological purposes, acknowledging observable reality, while avoiding official endorsement of folk beliefs that might conflict with church doctrine. Yet regardless of official reluctance to name what they were documenting, The community members who witnessed these exhumations understood perfectly what they were seeing. These were not abstract theological debates, but concrete evidence that the Gjenganger was real, that the dead could and did move in their graves when unfinished business bound them to the earth. The physical proof validated generations of folklore, confirmed the necessity of burial practices, and reinforced the social importance of maintaining obligations and resolving conflicts before death made resolution difficult or impossible. The archaeological evidence also revealed patterns in which types of deceased were most likely to show signs of disturbance. Those who died suddenly, without time to prepare or make peace, were overrepresented among disturbed graves. Victims of violence, particularly murder victims whose killers remained unpunished, showed the most dramatic evidence of attempted movement. Individuals who died heavily indebted or with known broken promises demonstrated clear signs of restlessness. The correlation between life circumstances and post-burial disturbance was strong enough to be predictive, allowing communities to identify which burials required extra precautions based on the deceased's situation at death. These findings from the grave transformed the Gjenganger from folklore into documented phenomenon, from story into evidence-based reality that demanded practical response. The disturbed bodies provided physical proof that something violated the natural order when people died with crucial matters unresolved, that the boundary between life and death could be disrupted by the weight of unfinished business. This evidence shaped behavior, motivated resolution of conflicts, and ensured that obligations were taken with deadly seriousness, because the alternative might be eternal restlessness for the dead and continued haunting for the living. The true power of the Gjenganger lies not in supernatural abilities or physical threat, but in its function as enforcer of the social contract, as guardian of the invisible bonds that held Scandinavian communities together through harsh winters and isolated existence. In societies where survival depended on cooperation and trust, where a broken promise or unpaid debt could ripple through the entire community with devastating consequences, the Gjenganger served as the ultimate accountability mechanism. They were not monsters from outside the social order, but products of it. Supernatural consequences for those who violated the fundamental obligations that made communal life possible. Consider the practical reality of Scandinavian village life in the centuries when Gjenganger belief was strongest and most influential. These were small, interdependent communities where everyone knew everyone else, where reputation and trustworthiness formed the foundation of all economic and social interaction. When a farmer borrowed grain to survive the winter, he borrowed not just from an individual, but from the community's shared resources. When a man made a promise to care for his aging parents or provide for a widow, that promise was witnessed by neighbors who would hold him accountable. The social fabric was woven from countless threads of obligation, and breaking those threads threatened to unravel the entire structure. In such an environment, enforcement of obligations could not rely solely on distant legal authorities or formal contracts. The law might take months to reach isolated communities. Judges and officials were rare and expensive, and written documentation was beyond the means of most ordinary people. Instead, communities relied on reputation, shame, and the collective memory of who could be trusted and who had failed their obligations. But what happened when someone died before fulfilling their responsibilities? How could the community maintain accountability when death seemingly offered escape from all earthly debts? The Gjenganger provided the answer. The belief that dying with unfinished business would trap you as a walking corpse, unable to rest, condemned to repeat your failure endlessly before the eyes of your community, created a powerful incentive to settle accounts before death. No one wanted to become Gjenganger, to be remembered not for their achievements or character, but for their restless walking, their obsessive haunting, their transformation into a cautionary tale. The fear of this fate motivated people to pay debts even when tempted to delay, to keep promises even when fulfillment proved difficult, to confess secrets even when silence seemed safer. This supernatural enforcement extended beyond mere financial obligations to encompass the entire web of social and moral responsibilities. A parent who promised to provide for all children equally could not simply favor one over others without risking the Gjenganger's fate if death came before the wrong was righted. A merchant who cheated customers could not die peacefully knowing his frauds would call him back. A murderer could not escape justice through death alone, because his victim might walk until the crime was avenged. Every broken trust, every unfulfilled vow, every unpaid debt became a potential chain binding the dead to earth. The genius of the Gjenganger belief as social mechanism lay in its universality and inevitability. Unlike human enforcement, which could be evaded through deception or distance, the Gjenganger was an automatic consequence, triggered by the mere fact of dying with unfinished business, regardless of whether anyone living knew about the obligation. A secret debt still bound the debtor. A hidden promise still trapped the promise maker, even if the community remained unaware. The supernatural enforcement operated at the level of objective truth rather than social knowledge, making it impossible to escape through clever lies or careful reputation management. This belief shaped deathbed behavior throughout Scandinavia in profound ways. The dying were encouraged to speak of anything weighing on their conscience, to reveal debts or secrets or promises that others might fulfill on their behalf. Families gathered not just to say farewell, but to help the dying person achieve the peace of settled accounts. Priests attended not only to provide spiritual comfort, but to witness confessions and facilitate resolutions. The deathbed became a place of radical honesty where social pretenses fell away and people spoke truths they had hidden for decades, motivated by the terror of becoming Gjenganger if they carried those secrets into the grave. Compare the Scandinavian Gjenganger to the revenant traditions of Western Europe, and both similarities and crucial differences emerge. Revenants, as they appear in French, English, and German folklore, are also corpses that return from the grave to haunt the living. They too often have unfinished business or grievances that bring them back. But the Western European revenant tends to be more violent, more overtly threatening, and less tied to specific social obligations than the Gjenganger. The revenant might return out of general malice or evil, without the focused obsession that defines the Nordic walking dead. The English revenant, for instance, often appears as a vampire-like creature that spreads disease and attacks the living physically. It might be created not by unfinished business, but by dying in sin or being buried improperly, by supernatural curse or demonic possession. The solution typically involves destruction of the body through decapitation or burning rather than resolution of earthly matters. The revenant is treated more as an evil entity to be destroyed than as a trapped soul to be released through appropriate action. The French revenant similarly tends toward the monstrous and violent, often associated with plague and contagion. Communities responded to revenant problems by exhuming and destroying the suspected corpse, sometimes performing elaborate rituals to ensure it could not rise again. The emphasis was on elimination of threat rather than understanding and resolution of the underlying cause. The revenant was enemy rather than victim, monster rather than tragic figure caught between worlds by circumstances beyond their control. The Gjenganger, by contrast, maintains its distinctly Nordic character through several key features. First, its appearance remains recognizably human rather than monstrous. reinforcing that this is a specific person rather than a generic evil entity. Second, its behavior is obsessive and repetitive, rather than randomly violent, focused entirely on the unfinished business rather than general malevolence. Third, the solution requires social action and resolution rather than physical destruction, emphasizing community responsibility and the importance of maintaining obligations. Fourth, the Gjenganger can happen to anyone regardless of moral character, making it a universal concern rather than punishment for wickedness. These differences reflect deeper cultural values and social structures. The Nordic emphasis on collective responsibility, on the interconnected of community obligations, on the importance of maintaining trust and fulfilling promises, all find expression in the Gjenganger tradition. The belief reinforced behaviors that Scandinavian societies needed to survive: cooperation, accountability, transparency in relationships, and the settlement of disputes before they could fester and divide the community. The Walking Dead served as mirror and enforcer, reflecting back the social contract and ensuring its maintenance through supernatural consequence. The decline of Gjenganger belief in modern Scandinavia corresponds not coincidentally with the rise of formal legal systems, written contracts, institutional enforcement mechanisms, and the breakdown of small, isolated communities into larger urban populations. When the law could be reliably invoked to settle debts, when contracts provided written proof of obligations, when communities became large enough that reputation mattered less and anonymity became possible, the need for supernatural enforcement diminished. The Gjenganger slowly retreated from lived reality into folklore and academic study, remembered but no longer feared as an immediate possibility. Yet the underlying truth that gave birth to the Gjenganger remains relevant across time and culture. We are all shaped by our unfulfilled obligations, by the promises we break and the debts we leave unpaid. We carry these failures with us whether or not they manifest as literal haunting, whether or not the dead literally walk to remind us of what remains unfinished. The Gjenganger externalized a psychological and social reality that exists independent of supernatural belief. That dying with accounts unsettled creates a kind of spiritual disturbance, a sense of incompleteness that affects both the dead and those they leave behind. Understand, then, that the Gjenganger was never merely a monster to frighten children or a superstition to be dismissed by modern rationality. It was a sophisticated social technology, a way of encoding and enforcing community values, a method of ensuring accountability that operated at both practical and spiritual levels. The Walking Dead of Scandinavia served their communities well for centuries, motivating ethical behavior and maintaining social cohesion through the simple but powerful fear of restless wandering should obligations go unfulfilled. As you reflect on these tales of the Gjenganger, consider what unfinished business you might be carrying, what obligations weigh on your conscience, what promises you have yet to fulfill. The Walking Dead may no longer haunt Scandinavian villages, but the principle they embodied remains eternally relevant, that our actions create consequences extending beyond our individual lives, that community depends on trust and accountability, and that dying with accounts settled brings a peace that dying with burdens unresolved can never achieve. If this journey into the Walking Dead of Scandinavia has captivated you, if you want to explore more folklore and mythology from cultures around the world, subscribe to this channel and join our growing community of mythology enthusiasts. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the Gjenganger tradition fascinates you most? And tell us what mythology you want us to explore next, whether it's more Nordic legends, creatures from other cultures, or deep dives into specific supernatural traditions. Your engagement shapes the content we create, So let us know what mysteries you want to unravel together. Until next time, remember that the stories we tell about death and obligation reveal truths about how we choose to live.